and brought him where he was before anybody in the community could get him and stone him to death. But when you think about that, you think about God and us.
Okay.
Praise God. What about Susan?
All right. Susan sent me a text and said she'll go after me because she's still working out some details over there. So we're going to go to our 8 o'clock class, the Protestant Reformation, session 10. And I've titled this Other 16th Century Reformers. So we've talked a lot about Luther, and you guys have your notes, right? And I sent a copy to Susan, so she has hers. At least I sent it through an email. So we talked about Luther in Germany and Zwingli in Switzerland, and Calvin in Geneva. And this evening's class is based upon the Church in History book, chapters 26 through 28. Things were happening in France, and like all great movements, the Reformation had its roots far back in history. There through several centuries, and these are things that we've talked about. Among other things, the Renaissance and the writings of Erasmus, the Cluny Reform, and all kinds of other groups that we had talked about, the Albigenses and the Waldenses, who still lingered in southern France. And there was Professor Jacques Lefebvre. I know I messed up that name. Whenever I say that name, you smile, so I know I'm saying it wrong. In 1512, published the French translation and commentary of Paul's epistles, and that did a lot to and made an impact in France. So a lot of these things were happening independent of the actual Reformation. It amazes me how God is working in different places at the same time through different people along the same theme. And things were happening as Luther was dealing with the church in Germany. God was working through Zwingli in Switzerland and through multiple people in France also. I had a note here, page 211, so there was apparently something on 211 that I wanted to read. The Reformation movement could not be stopped. It found followers first in all the cities. The early recruits of the Reformation in France were merchants and artisans, but the reading of the Bible and the books of Luther soon made a practice among the middle and higher class. Under the inspiration of Margaret, the king's sister, small private groups were organized at the royal court to read the Bible in secret, because King Francis was still, he was a staunch Catholic and very much opposed. In fact, was executing many Protestant leaders. But yet his own sister she had published a book about the Reformation, and she was conducting these secret Bible studies in the royal court. Luther had wide influence in France, and most of Luther's writings were translated into French, arousing widespread interest, and including Margaret, the king's sister, as I said. There were many short tracts that made propaganda for Luther's ideas, and they continued to be published. And though still illegal, it's estimated in 1534 that there were 30,000 followers of Luther in Paris alone. That's not counting the other towns and villages and throughout the country. But 30,000 followers of Luther in Paris alone. The followers of Luther lacked organization, and there was no unified leadership. And for a while, it seemed that it seemed like Farel might supply the leadership. Farel was learned, he was eloquent, he was full of fiery zeal, and he had brought the Reformation to Geneva. Farel persuaded a man by the name of Olivten, who was a relative of Calvin's and a Greek scholar, to make a French translation of the New Testament. And, this translation was a great help, but the Reformation movement in France remained confused. So Calvin does step up and take the leadership of the Protestant Reformation to a large degree in Geneva, but it also influenced far beyond Geneva. In 1536, Erasmus, there's basically four key things that happened in 1536. 1536 was a key year. Erasmus and Lefebvre died, and their deaths spelled the end of the Christian Renaissance movement within the Catholic Church. The aim with them was to reform the church, within the church without breaking away. If both of these guys, Erasmus and Lefebvre, were proclaiming Reformation type ideas, but they wouldn't directly attack the Catholic Church. They were embracing the Reformation ideas, and they would critique priests as far as some of the things that they did, their practices, and of course indulgences and things like that. But they did not attack the church itself, and they were never excommunicated. But in that same year, 1536, both of them died, and that kind of signaled the end of trying to reform the church within the church. And in 1536 also was when Calvin published his book, The Institutes for Christian Living, or the Christian Religion. He also began his labors in Geneva. He published his book early in 1536, and by fall 1536 he was very actively involved in Geneva, taking a leadership position in the Reformation. So the events of 1536 placed Calvin as the head of the Reformation movement in France and Geneva. Up till 1536, the Reformation in France had gained numerous followers, but there was no organization. So Calvin supplied a statement of doctrine, a form of public worship, and a system of church government. And also, Calvin was similar to the Apostle Paul in apparently doing a lot of extensive correspondence, letters to various Protestant leaders in France. So from Geneva and then in Strasbourg and then later in Geneva again, he was carrying on an extensive correspondence with many leaders in France, providing them leadership. I don't know if he actually, from the time he went into Geneva, if he did any extensive traveling or not, but he did do extensive correspondence with many leaders many pastors in France, throughout France. So the Reformation in France does mature, and it was not long before even in Paris, there was a well-organized church meeting in secret places because it was still illegal. In 1559, there were many Protestant churches throughout the land. In fact, it's estimated that 1 out of 6 of the people in France were Protestant. And that, to me, that's unbelievable that 1 out of 6 of the citizens would be Protestant, considering the fact that it was illegal and they were meeting in secret. In 1559, the Protestant churches in Paris, or in France, they held a synod in Paris, again in secret, and they adopted the creed that is called the Gallic Confession. And this synod organized the Protestant churches in France on a national scale based upon Calvin's ideas. So the churches in France, the Protestant churches, which were meeting in secret, they did organize secretly and became a national church, or a national denomination, we could say. They organized with a statement of faith sent to them by Calvin. Actually, they came up with a statement of faith, sent it to Calvin, and Calvin added to it and made some suggestions and sent it back to them. And anyway, through correspondence with Calvin, they came up with a statement of faith. And that started in 1557, but the actual synod was in 1559. 20 delegates representing 72 churches met secretly in Paris to expand upon Calvin's confession. In 1560, the French Confession of Faith was presented to the king with a preference requesting that the persecution cease, which it did not. But up till now, they were called Lutheran or Calvinists, but now they adopted the name Huguenots. And I tried hard to figure out where Huguenots came from, and the only thing I can come up with is that nobody knows. I found places that say there are several theories as to where the Huguenots, the same forces that prepared the way elsewhere, was now at work in the Netherlands also. The Brethren of the Common Life had paved the way for the Reformation in the Netherlands, and there was a lot of confusion there though, because the Brethren of the Common Life were Catholic. They stayed within the Catholic system. They were similar to Lefebvre and Erasmus. They stayed within the Catholic system. But there was also there were people in the Netherlands who called themselves Lutheran. There were people in the Netherlands that called themselves Zwinglian, and there were plenty of Anabaptists there too. So there was a lot of confusion, and they lacked leadership there also. Calvin becomes the main influence. On page 213 in section 6, for the sake of time, I'm not going to read all of this, but it talks about some of the things that was taking place there. The Belgic Confession. Calvin brought order out of chaos in Geneva, then later in France, and then also in the Netherlands. It was Calvin's writings that influenced the Netherlands. So it wasn't until 1550, though, that the people in the Netherlands began to feel the impact of Calvin. So before 1550, most of them would either identify, if they were Protestant, they would identify as Lutheran or Zwinglian. Zwingli's followers usually refer to themselves as Reform or Reformers. But after 1550, it was mostly Calvin that was influencing the Netherlands. So all Protestants of the Reformed faith love and revere Luther as an heroic initiative in the mighty struggle for freedom from Rome, but they see Calvin as their spiritual father. In 1561, Brez drew up a confession of faith known as the Belgic Confession, which is also known as the Netherlandish Confession, and also the 37 Articles. So let's talk about the church in Scotland. Preparation in Scotland was taking place. Scotland was a poor country, and it was ruled over by a weak king, and feudal lords were constantly fighting. John Knox is the primary guy that we're going to talk about here in Scotland. And so this is the environment that he grew up in. Most of the advanced culture was in the southern part of Europe, but in the northern part of Europe, it was poor and not nearly as advanced in many ways. But rumor had reached Scotland of a great and strange German Reformation movement, and several young Scotsmen visited Luther's University at Wittenberg, and upon returning, they sowed the seeds of Luther's doctrines in the soil of their native country, Scotland, and others imported and distributed some of Luther's writings. There were now at least 3 English translations circulating. There was what we had talked about before, the Wycliffe translation, but there was also Tyndale and Coverdale, which wrote translations. Now the difference is Wycliffe, or Wycliffe, however you say his name, his translation was a English translation of Jerome's Vulgate. So it was a translation from the Latin. And this was 200 years earlier, and I think, if I remember correctly, that was the 14th century. Now it's the 16th century, and the second half of the 16th century. And during those 250 years, the English language changed quite dramatically. I mean, it may seem odd that it would change that much, but if you just think of how our English has changed since the founding of the country, there are changes. Probably not as much, but if you were to get a hold of the Wycliffe translation, even here in the 16th century, many of them felt like the Wycliffe translation was just not readable. Tyndale put together a English New Testament, which it was better, at least potentially better, because he didn't translate from the Vulgate, he translated from the original Greek. And he translated the New Testament only. Now, he did translate portions of the Old Testament, but not the entire Old Testament. maybe he had planned on it, but he ended up getting executed before he got much of the Old Testament translated. And then Coverdale translated all of the Old Testament and the New Testament into English. So that's the primary difference between these three translations. So the early Protestants in Scotland met for worship and instruction in private homes, and they did have at least three different possibilities of a Bible in their own language by this time. Anyway, the Tyndale translation was written in 1525. The Coverdale was translated in 1535, so there's a 10-year difference there. So gradual transition from Lutheranism to Calvinism occurred under a man by the name of George Wishart. Now he taught New Testament as the schoolmaster at Montrose and until investigated for heresy by the Bishop of Brechin in 1538. So he fled to England, where a similar charge was brought against him, heresy, and in the following years. So under examination by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, he recanted those some of his utterances. By 1542, he had entered Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, where he studied and taught. In 1543, he returned to Scotland and was allowed to return to Montrose, and again, he taught Scripture. Now, I don't know, there was a little bit change in the atmosphere and an easing up of some of the ideas, but his career as an itinerant preacher began in 1544, where he traveled Scotland from east to west. And Wishart's preaching from 1544 and 1545 helped popularize the teachings of Calvin and Zwingli in Scotland. The story has been told by John Knox, a disciple of his. He went from place to place in danger of his life, denouncing the errors of the papacy and the abuses of the church. In 1546, he was seized and taken prisoner, and he was hanged, and his body was burned in 1546. Fox and Knox both attribute to him a prophecy of the death of the cardinal. Apparently Wishart proclaimed a prophecy either when he was dying or before he died that the cardinal was going to be assassinated, and just a few months later, May 29th of that same year, he was assassinated, and partly in revenge for Wishart's death. So it might have been like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Someone did it just in revenge. I don't know. But anyway, he proclaimed that the true church was where the word of God was faithfully preached and the two sacraments rightly administered. All right, so Wishart paved the way, and he brought the Calvinist ideas into Scotland, but John Knox was destined to be the great reformer in Scotland, not Wishart. And in 1547, the French fleet captured Knox, and he was made a prisoner for 19 months, and he toiled daily as a slave. And after those 19 months, he was released. It's interesting to read what some of these guys went through, because you hear the name Knox and all these names, and you don't really know that much about them until you start studying stuff like this. But during those 19 months, it says that he toiled as a galley slave. Day after day, he had to ply the oars in the hot, smelly holds of the French ship. Sometimes he was made to feel the lash, and constantly he was pestered with suggestions that he should pray to the image of Mary. Anyway, after he was released, he went to England for 5 years, and he helped Archbishop Cranmer organize the church in England. And we'll talk about the Church of England pretty soon, and because things were happening in England at the same time. But in 1555, actually after England, he went to Geneva and became even more fully indoctrinated in Calvinism. So he he didn't have plans to go back to Scotland. He was from Scotland, but he knew Protestantism really wasn't welcomed there. So he, in England, there was a little bit a changing of the church taking place there with the Church of England. But after 5 years in England, he went to Geneva, of course, where Protestantism was the official religion. But in 1555, he visited his homeland, his native land of Scotland, and preached with great feeling against the Mass. And he sent a letter to Mary of Lorraine, the regent of Scotland at that time, and a strong Catholic. But he sent a letter to her about the gospel and about the Protestant ideas. She took the letter as a joke at first, according to the book. She didn't take the letter seriously at all, but once she realized that things were happening and people were taking Knox seriously, then she decided she needs to take Knox seriously, and she put a sentence of death on Knox. But by this time, Knox had already returned to Geneva because he was just visiting Scotland. He wasn't planning on staying. He came and preached and stirred things up and then went back to Geneva. She couldn't do anything about him, so she burned him in effigy. Knox revolutionizes Scotland. The Reformation progresses in Scotland in spite of Mary's aggressive objections. Knox, just like the Apostle Paul and just like Calvin in Geneva, Knox corresponds with letters with the Reformation leaders in Scotland, and they urge him to return. So in 1559, Knox does come back to Scotland, and he took the helm of leadership with fiery preaching. The preaching of Knox was powerful, and on page 217, section 3, I wanted to read these first two paragraphs here. After Knox returned, the Reformation in that land swept forward. The preaching of Knox was powerful. His style was direct, vigorous, and plain. Frequently, he employed sparkling wit and cutting satire. Of his preaching it was said, others lop off branches, but this man strikes at the root. In the pulpit he was so energetic that he seemed likely to pound it to pieces and fly out of it. The preaching of Knox was like a spark in a keg of gunpowder. Wherever he preached, there followed iconoclastic explosion. Images were broken and monasteries stormed by the mob. He wrote, the places of idolatry were made level with the ground, the monuments of idolatry consumed with fire, and the priests were commanded under pain of death to desist from their blasphemous mass. Now, so it sounds like they were being very aggressive, probably more aggressive than what they needed to be. But so Knox was the primary person to bring true Reformation into Scotland. In 1560, the Scottish Parliament decreed Protestantism the official religion instead of Catholicism. Now, the monarchy, the ruling monarchy, was still Catholic, but Parliament embraced Protestantism, and the Pope's authority and all jurisdiction by Catholic leaders was abolished, and the Mass was forbidden. Maintenance of the true religion was declared to be the prime duty of government. Ministers were paid by the state, so they embraced the idea of the state ruling over, or not necessarily ruling over, but the ministers were paid by the state. And so I don't know if they took up offerings or not, but they received their salary from the government. So John Knox was equivalent to the Pope in his authority and control over the Church of Scotland. So it was basically his church. All right, so the church in Scotland is organized, and in each local church, the pastor and the elders, on page 218 in the right column, that last big paragraph there, it mentions basically 4 different words, which I just found them interesting. They're in italics in the textbook, but the word session, I have them in quotes on the outline. In each local church, the pastor and elders constituted what was called a session. The meeting of churches in an area maybe, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 churches, I don't know how many, but a small area. The delegated ministers and elders to these groups was called a presbytery or presbyteries. Now, presbytery, of course, comes from the Greek word for elders. If you look up the elder in the New Testament is the Greek word presbytery. So this is a word from the Bible. I'm not sure where they come up with all these other words, but presbytery at least is a biblical word. I don't think they're using it properly, but that's where they start using that word. But meetings of groups of presbyteries. So a presbytery, as they were using it, as I understand it, unless my understanding of it is incorrect, a presbytery would be a small group of churches, each one sending an elder or a pastor to represent their church. And then the synod would be meetings of a group of presbyteries. So it's like a larger group of churches with their delegated ministers. That was called the synod. And then the meeting of all the churches in the country was called the General Assembly. Again, a pastor or a delegated elder or minister from each of the churches would be represented at each of these meetings. For conduct of the public worship, Knox prepared a Book of Common Order based upon Calvin's teachings, based on Calvin's book. He had the same type of book. So the church is organized by Calvin in Geneva. The church organized by Calvin in Geneva became the pattern for the Huguenots in France and the Reformed Church in the Netherlands and the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. All right, so the church is firmly established in Scotland, and on page 219 it says, Mary, Queen of the Scots, was an unyielding Catholic. So the Parliament was embracing Protestantism, but Mary, the Queen of the Scots, was an unyielding Catholic. She was a woman of ability and great personal charm. The first 3 years of her reign, she made considerable progress in regaining for the Roman Catholic the ground that had been lost. But the cause of the Reformation was saved in the end by Queen Mary's mistakes. Her unwise acts and immoral life threw Scotland into confusion and the Roman Catholic Church into disrepute. The leaders as well as the people in general turned to Protestantism. By the year 1570, the Presbyterian Church was firmly established in Scotland. 2 years later, November 24th, John Knox died. Knox's career had been stormy, but he had shown himself to be a great fighter, a man of dauntless courage, and he had reformed the church in Scotland. And furthermore, by reforming the Scottish church, John Knox, more than any other man, molded the character of the Scottish nation. And if you're familiar with, I think everybody is familiar with, at least to some degree, the Presbyterian Church. It's traced back to Scotland and John Knox, and really it can be traced back even further to John Calvin, because Knox was 100% Calvinist in everything he said and did, and he modeled everything from what he learned from Calvin, and he actually lived in Geneva, and I'm sure probably met Calvin personally, I would assume. Finally, the church in England, 1534 to 1563. Now, some of the earliest influence of Protestantism, before it was known as Protestantism, or Reformation, we could say, was John Wycliffe. Again, a couple hundred years before the Protestant Reformation actually began. But John Wycliffe was stirring the church during the 14th and 15th century, and he prepared the way for the Protestant Reformation. Many of those who became leaders in the Reformation in England were acquainted with Wycliffe's writings, as well as Erasmus. Erasmus lectured in England. He lectured at Cambridge University and had many friends in England, and his writings were widely read throughout England. 4 months after Luther's 95 Theses was published, Erasmus had them sent to England and translated into English to his friends in England. And even though Erasmus himself was still considered a Catholic, he did embrace the ideas of Luther, even though he didn't embrace the Protestant Reformation movement entirely. So after many After that, many of Luther's books and pamphlets were imported into England. And then Tyndale translated the Bible in 1525, as I had already mentioned. Tyndale became acquainted with the ideas of Erasmus, then of Luther, and then of Zwingli. After 200 years, the English language had undergone great changes, and Wycliffe's translation was not understood. So Tyndale translated the New Testament from the original Greek, not from the Latin Vulgate, as Wycliffe had done. Later, he translated portions of the Old Testament. He did this in the face of fierce opposition and bitter persecution, and Tyndale suffered a martyr's death in 1536. His Bible did much to further the Reformation in England and Scotland. And then in 1535, Miles Coverdale also translated the whole Bible into English. Henry VIII. Of course, England does go through major changes, but the way it happens in England is far different than the way it happens in the other countries. Henry, as we probably all know, he applied to the Pope for a divorce from his wife, Catherine. He wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, and apparently it needed to be approved in order for him to remain a staunch Catholic or a strong Catholic. It needed to be approved by the Pope. But after much time passed, and still the Pope did not give a decision, at last the king's patience grew thin, and he decided to take things into his own hands. As a very powerful king and able to control Parliament, in 1534 he had Parliament pass a law which decreed that the king justly and rightfully is and ought to be the supreme head of the church in England. And this law is called the Act of Supremacy. Okay? The Act of Supremacy, meaning he is supreme, not the Pope. He is supreme, not of the government only, but of the church also. So the Act of Supremacy didn't change the doctrine, and it didn't change the worship. It only changed the church government, replacing the Pope with the king as its head. So it was a big change, but it couldn't be called Reformation. Even though there was a major change taking place in England as far as the way the church was run, it was far from being a true Reformation, all right? At least at this point, at least under Henry. So Henry regarded Luther as a heretic, and as early as 1518, he had written a book against heretics entitled The Seven Sacraments. And for doing so, for that service, the Pope had bestowed upon him the title Defender of the Faith. So Henry, in many respects, in many ways, he was a Catholic, and in fact, he named himself the head of the church in place of the Pope, but he did not feel that he ceased from being a good Orthodox Catholic. Now, most of the English, and I don't know if I would say most, but many of the English people embraced the breaking from Rome. They welcomed that very much, but they were dissatisfied with the fact that there was really not much of a difference in the church at all. On page 223, section 3, not all the Englishmen were willing to submit to the Act of Supremacy. So Henry had another law passed, the law of treason and heresy. This law stated that to hold any doctrine other than those of the Catholic Church was heresy, and to refuse to acknowledge the king as the head of the church in England was treason. So really, he's getting probably both Protestants and Catholics upset with him, because the Catholics want to be loyal to the Pope, but now they're not allowed to be. And the Protestants want to change the doctrine, but they're not allowed to. So he's probably not, there's probably weren't too many people happy with him. But under the law of treason and heresy, a number of persons were put to death. Monks were executed for denying the supremacy of the king. Two very prominent men, John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, and Sir Thomas More, one of the England's most illustrious scholars, were executed. Both had refused to take the oath of supremacy. For his opposition to the Act of Supremacy, the Pope had rewarded the Bishop Fisher by making him cardinal. The Pope had made him cardinal, and a cardinal wears a certain kind of red hat. In a fit of fury, the king exclaimed that he would send the bishop's head to Rome to get the hat, the 76-year-old bishop was beheaded in June of 1535. Now, Sir Thomas More had been a zealous Catholic and had caused many English Lutherans to be sent to the stake. Now the tables were turned. More was beheaded in July. So More, who was responsible for executing many Lutherans, he himself gets executed because he doesn't want to acknowledge the king as the head of the church. At the close of his reign, many citizens were still loyal to Catholicism, and others were still loyal to Lutheranism. And then comes along his son, Edward VI. After Henry dies, Edward VI becomes king. Now he's a child. I don't know exactly how old he was when he became king, but he was young and not a very strong leader. And Parliament took into their own hands to pass laws providing many changes in doctrine, worship, and practices. And in 1549, Parliament passed the Act of Uniformity, making the Book of Common Prayer compulsory in all the churches. And in 1552, the first Act of Uniformity and Book of Common Prayer did not please a lot of people, so they redid it in 1552, and it began to look very much like a Protestant church under Henry VI, Edward VI. Henry VIII was very Catholic in his actions, in his practices, other than making himself, in essence, the Pope. But Edward VI, probably just because he was a child and didn't really know what was going on, Parliament began to mold the church into more of a Protestant-looking church. On page 225, section 5, the Reformation made progress also in matters of doctrine. A new creed formulated by Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, with the help of 6 other theologians, including Knox, it was put into final shape. Remember when I was talking about John Knox, that he had gone to England for 5 years? That's basically this time frame under Edward VI. Edward VI was basically king for I think just 5 or 6 years, or maybe less than that. But it was during that time that Knox was there, helping Cranmer to mold the church into more of a Protestant-looking church. And Cranmer sent John Knox and others to all the churches, training the priests. Because remember, the priests, the bishops and the priests, they were all trained as Catholics, and now they're Church of England. Okay, but they're thinking their theology is still Catholic. So Cranmer and Knox and some others put a lot of effort into retraining everybody into Protestant Reformation theology. All right, so that's what was taking place while Edward was the king. Edward died of tuberculosis in 1553 at age 16, making his sister Mary ruler of the nation, and she has this nickname Bloody Mary because she was very anti-Protestant. She was a strong Catholic, and she proceeded to set the clock of the Reformation back. In fact, even further than Edward, her father Henry did. She actually wanted the church to submit again to the Pope as the authority. So the laws regarding the church, which Parliament had passed previously, were repealed, and bishops and all lower clergy who were to favor the Reformation were made to leave office, and many leading Protestants fled the country, and others were executed. Cardinal Pole, who had fled the continent during Henry's reign, returned to England. Parliament voted the restoration of the authority of the Pope over the Church of England, and it reenacted the laws against heresy and repealed the legislation of Henry VIII with reference to the church. The work of the Reformation in England was entirely undone. The church was again as it had been before, with one exception. In 1555 was a terrifying year for the Protestant church. Before the year was over, 75 persons in various parts of the land were put to death by fire. The most notable victims of Mary's persecution were the two bishops Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley. As the flames curled around their bodies, Latimer spoke courage and comfort to his fellow martyr. This day we shall light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust it shall never be put out. Mary was not yet satisfied. Her next victim was Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. Let's talk a minute about Thomas Cranmer, who this guy was. In 1532, Henry VIII appointed Cranmer to be the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury. And prior to his archbishopric, Cranmer was a preacher at the University of Cambridge. He had traveled the continent, where he had met the Pope, the Emperor, and many Lutheran leaders. After Henry's death, Cranmer became the moving force of the Reformation in England. And as I had mentioned before, he was the one that brought Knox in to help teach the clergy and other people on Reformation ideas. In 1555, he was executed, or I'm sorry, in 1555 he was excommunicated from Catholicism and executed in 1556 under the leadership of Mary. On page 227, late in the year 1555, he was excommunicated from Rome. Cardinal Pole was appointed to the office which had thus fallen vacant. Cranmer, now weakened, he declared that he recognized the authority of the Pope over the Church, as it had recently been restored by law. But Mary was bent on Cranmer's death. Knowing Cranmer's weakness, she hoped that he might be made to renounce Protestantism publicly before he died. It was believed that he would do great harm to the cause of the Reformation. Cranmer did sign a statement in which he denied Protestantism. He was physically weak and probably mentally weak, and he did deny Protestantism in a document, but that didn't stop them from going forward with the execution. So the time of his execution in Oxford was set for March 21st, 1556. Just before he was to die, he renounced the denial. So he denied the Protestant movement, but then he denied the denial, so or renounced the denial. And once more, in the strongest terms, declared his Protestant faith. In dramatic fashion, he showed how he felt that his denial of the principles of Reformation, the hand which he signed the denial, he held into the flames until it burned to a crisp. Then the flames scorched his body, and he died the death of a martyr and a hero. So then after that, Mary dies, and her sister Elizabeth becomes the queen. Now Elizabeth is 180 degrees opposite of Mary. Elizabeth embraces the Reformation, and things under Elizabeth's rule, she again becomes the head of the Church of England. The Church of England, of course, is known also as the Anglican Church and the Episcopal Church. It's all the same thing. But once again, she restores basically her father's idea of them being independent from Rome, and she embraced Protestantism much more fully than anyone else in her family had. I think with that, we will bring this to a close.